The first attribute is direct explanation. In direct explanation, the teacher always states his or her objective and the desired outcome for the objective. You want to make the objectives as measurable as possible so that you can find out at the end whether the students have actually met your objective for the day. All right? So we often start out by saying, today we are going to. Then I want to explain why. As the teacher, it's really important to make that connection between what the objective is and what the purpose of the objective is. We want them to be able to transfer that learning to other subject areas, to later lessons. So if we explain why they're doing something, it helps them understand when to actually use that particular skill. So we often say, this is why the skill is important. And then we always share the assessment tool as part of direct explanation. It's really important that students understand exactly how they will, the teacher will measure whether they've learned or met the objective. Okay? During direct explanation, we always want to choose very clear, precise, student-friendly language. The goal is never to confuse the child by using academic language that might be above their level of understanding. So we want to bring this down to a level that all students can access. So we make it something that they can actually repeat back or rephrase for us. We want to make a direct connection to any previously learned material that might help them understand what our goal is for the day. And we want to pre-teach any pertinent vocabulary. So any words that the teacher has identified as potentially difficult or confusing for the student, or words that are essential to the meaning of the particular text, are words that we pre-teach at the very beginning of the lesson as part of direct explanation. The second attribute is called modeling, and then we often call this the I-do phase. It's very teacher-centered. The teacher is actually modeling for the students or demonstrating for the students exactly what she expects them to do when it's their turn. All right? So we use a metacognitive strategy whenever possible. We often use think-alouds, but I would think through the process of using the skill so that students can see exactly what it is I expect them to do when it's their turn. It also helps them get insight into what a good reader or a good writer does, because you're thinking out loud, this is how I would approach it. This is what I would do as a good reader or as a good writer. We want to limit our language and speak very clearly to the students to make sure that they are understanding everything we're saying. And we want to make as much eye contact as possible because you're checking to see that they're really engaged with the lesson, that they're comprehending what's happening, and that they're paying attention to what's going on. This is really important because you're showing students exactly how they will demonstrate proficiency to you. You often provide an exemplar. So you find a piece of work maybe that another student has created in a different year, or that you create one yourself to show them exactly what a really strong piece of work would look like. So if you're doing an essay, you would have a model essay. It's often a good idea to have a non-example as well to contrast, because it helps students to see on a scale of 1 to 4, this essay is only a 2, and this one is a 4, and here's how the 2 can get to a 3 or get to a 4. So that contrast between a really strong essay and a weaker essay often makes the difference for kids who are not quite sure what it was that was lacking in their own work. The third attribute is guided practice. This is where the teacher allows the students time to do a comparable exercise on their own, but she is providing an ongoing dialogue with them. So she's providing feedback, verification, letting them know that what they're doing is working or isn't working, how they might fix what they're doing. She's also taking time to probe their thoughts, really talk to them, see how they got to the answer that they've arrived at. Whatever exercise she chooses to let them practice needs to parallel exactly what she modeled. This is not the time to introduce a new level of skill. You're really just asking the students to do what you did as the teacher, because they need an opportunity to practice it to see how it'll really work when they do have to go do it alone. You want to use as many methods as possible to assess mastery. So you might use a choral read, an echo read. You might have them write something. You might have dialogue with them. But you just want to make sure that they're really on the same page as you, that they understand what they're being asked to do. Because you would never want to move on to the application attribute, not really being sure whether they actually understood what it was they were being called to do. You also want to walk around as much as possible and actually read the work that they're creating, or actually talk to them like we said before. But you don't want to be standing in the front of the room. This is really a time for you to interact with the kids. And they might have questions for you as well. Okay? You need to be careful that you provide any additional time needed. If they have additional questions you didn't foresee, you might need to factor in some extra time. You might actually need to go back and model again for them. Remember, this is a very recursive process. That's why we said it's not sequential. You might have modeled, given them the opportunity to practice, and then you realize through your observations of their work that they didn't actually understand the first time, and you need to take a step back and model again for them. So it's very recursive in nature. So we always provide time for extra dialogue and extra practice. The fourth attribute is called corrective feedback and verification. Corrective feedback is when the teacher lets the student know your answer in this instance is not actually correct because, so you always provide the why, but you do give them the correct answer as well. You want them to understand why they didn't arrive at the correct answer and how they could really get to the correct answer. You can also take the opportunity to probe their thought process. Well, you gave the answer X. Talk to me about how you got there. How did you get to X? Why did you think it was X instead of Y? And that's the opportunity for the students to really have a good dialogue with you about how they've approached the problem. Sometimes in the younger grades, but also in the upper grades, we might say, hold on a second, it's my turn. Give the correct answer and ask the students to repeat it back, depending on the skill that you're trying to teach. But it's a good opportunity to provide that direct instruction. You always let the students practice again whenever possible, and you really want them to understand why. That's really the goal, not just that they can mimic the answer, because Crystal might have been able to give me the correct answer, but no one else in the room knows why Crystal's answer was correct. So you always want to get to the why part so that every student walks away understanding exactly what you were asking. Verification implies that they gave you the correct answer, but it's your duty to make sure they explain how they got the correct answer. Again, it's for the benefit of the other students in the room so that they all hear the process that got that student to the correct answer. And it's also really important for that student to think through her own processes. And the fifth and final phase is independent practice. We often call this the you-do piece. We want to provide students with time to practice independently. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the class, it might end up being homework that they take outside of the room. But it's really important that they have that opportunity to practice to mastery. So you've modeled the lesson for them. You've modeled the skill. You've allowed them to practice with feedback from you. They can ask any questions that they need. You've given verification and feedback. And now it's their opportunity to practice this independently. Whatever assignment you give, again, has to parallel exactly what it is that you modeled, that they practiced. Because they're going to be working independently at this point. You're not there to provide the feedback. They might be at home where they don't have you as a resource. So you want to make sure that whatever they're doing parallels what you taught. And then you have opportunity later to extend that and to push it to a higher level of Bloom's taxonomy. But at first, until you're sure that they've attained mastery, you really don't want to change up that skill level at all. Okay? If they're doing it in the room with you, you should also be, again, you should be walking around and monitoring, but you've pulled back a bit at this point. We often talk about the gradual release of responsibility model. You can see in the beginning, when the teacher is giving direct explanation and modeling for the students, it's completely teacher-centered. But as she goes on through the guided practice attribute and allows them to respond to her and she provides feedback, by the time you've hit the fourth level, you've actually released responsibility as the teacher, and it's completely student-centered at that point. But you want to do it very gradually to make sure that they've really attained mastery. So what actually is the difference between an implicit lesson and an explicit lesson? Let's talk about it. An implicit lesson would be content-based. So instead of assessing what skill needs to be taught and choosing a piece of literature that meets that need, the teacher picks a story she likes to teach. And then she plugs the standards in later and she plugs the skill in later. It might not be a perfect fit. In a social studies class, we teach a lot of Civil War facts instead of really using particular skills. In an explicit lesson, it's very skills-based. The teacher chooses the story as a vehicle to teach the skill instead of vice versa. The teacher might be teaching students how to analyze a particular primary source, and that's a skill that they'll walk away with. She can still factor in the Civil War facts that are important, but she's really teaching them a pertinent skill that can transfer to another subject area. In an implicit lesson, skills are taught without consideration for the developmental sequence. So instead of starting with a topic sentence and moving to a basic paragraph, and then the structure of an essay, the teacher starts immediately with the essay. So she really hasn't taken into consideration where the students are coming from. In an explicit lesson, they're taught sequentially, and there's an understanding that the teacher might have to go back and actually reteach pieces of the lesson that they haven't actually learned. So she would instead start with the sentence, then go to the paragraph level, and eventually to the essay level. So there's an order, an explicit order in the way she teaches. In an implicit lesson, the teacher expects students to infer missing information. So there's often gaps in her directions. There's gaps in the skills that she's trying to teach. So students are forced to try to interpret what she's saying and maybe plug in some holes in the actual lesson. The skills are not being taught directly. Okay? So instead of giving a definition of imagery, she would actually jump in and say, who knows what imagery is? Or, this is the definition of a simile. Instead, she would say, tell me, has anyone ever studied similes? And expect the students to pull that information out of prior knowledge without actually having provided the information first. In an explicit lesson, she's always modeling the skills and she uses very precise language. So she would tell the student exactly what they have to do. She's not assuming that they can fill in the gaps in her information. In an implicit lesson, she might rely on teachable moments. Now, we've all used these in the past. We've all fallen victim to this. There's nothing wrong with providing additional information to a student who has a pertinent question. But sometimes the questions can take us off track. An implicit teacher would allow that to happen instead of staying focused on her lesson. An explicit teacher would be very clear that she can answer the question, but she needs to stay focused on the actual goal for the day. What is the objective for the day? So she doesn't allow herself to get pulled off into tangential conversation. In an implicit lesson, the feedback might be very vague. You might hear things like, good job, nice work, that's great, without ever actually explaining why the work was good or great. So there was no probing, and there's no purpose given to the students. So other students might know that the answer is correct, but not know why. In an explicit lesson, the feedback is very specific. So the teacher not only verifies that it's correct, but she also explains why it's correct, or she asks the student to explain why it's correct. If it was wrong, she provides the correct answer, and she also works with the student to figure out how they got to the incorrect answer and how to get them back on track. In an implicit lesson, the teacher expects students to apply the skill immediately. Oftentimes there is little modeling, perhaps no modeling, and there's no time for guided practice. So the direct explanation is provided, directions are given, and students are immediately asked to start the lesson. So they really haven't had that time to gain mastery at all. They've jumped immediately to application. In an explicit lesson, there's plenty of time for student practice, and the teacher has actually modeled it for them. So they've seen the skill in action, they've had the opportunity to practice, and then they're asked to apply their knowledge.